I want to keep this conversation going with Ivo Dalder. He's the former U.S. ambassador to NATO and is a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Thank you for being here. I mean, we're hearing from Ukrainian President Zelensky, who seems to be now praising the discussion, saying that President Trump is listening to his country's needs. We heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio that this seems to be the most positive day that they've had since the beginning of their engagements here. I just wonder, how are you analyzing, at the very least, the posturing we have seen from the Ukrainian and American sides on the other side of these negotiations?
Well, this is really the first time, this day is the first time that very serious talks are being held between the United States and Ukraine. Until this time, until the very beginning of President Trump getting back into office in the second term, the idea has been that the United States and Russia will negotiate, provide and send a plan to Ukraine to sign on the dotted line. And indeed, that's what happened once again this week. A plan negotiated between Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, was put together, this 28-point plan, and presented to the Ukrainians on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. What happened today, what is very important, is the Ukrainians were able to sit down with the United States and say, hey, wait a minute, before you tell us what it is that we need to sign on, how about you listen to our side of the story? We, after all, are the victims of this aggression. And rather than sitting down with the aggressor, why don't you sit down with the victim to see where we can come out? And so I'm hopeful that the kind of body language and the kind of language we're seeing from both President Zelensky on the one hand and Secretary of State Rubio on the other will finally put us onto a path where there is a discussion between the United States and Ukraine, and I would say to Europeans to be part of this before a plan is presented to the Russians, which frankly, they should be presented with a take-it-or-leave-it plan.
And I wanted to ask you about that because, look, you're former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and Secretary Rubio mentioned that there were certain aspects of their negotiations that they sort of segregated or put to the side that would essentially need the sign-off of EU and NATO representatives. What sort of issues might fall into that bucket that the United States, Ukraine, and potentially Russia wouldn't be able to sort of hammer out on their own here?
You know, just about everything. So the question of security guarantees is not something that the United States, living on the other side of the ocean, can provide without European and NATO support. So anything that has to do with the question of the security of Ukraine after this war is either something the Ukrainians have to decide themselves, which is a strong army that is not limited in size or capabilities, or in fact, by the Europeans, whether they are willing to provide the kind of capabilities both to make that security guarantee real and to open up the possibility of both NATO and EU membership. So that's one area. The other is on the economic side. The Russian assets that have been frozen largely are in Europe. In the 28-point plan, those assets were distributed by the United States and Russia, neither of whom have control over those assets without input from the Europeans. And indeed, the United States in that 28-point plan was going to take a share of those assets, which is quite remarkable when you just think about it. So in almost every aspect that you have to deal with in order to get a real ceasefire and to make that ceasefire real, let alone a negotiation on territory, which can only be done by the Ukrainians and Russians, you cannot get there unless the Europeans are not only on board, but they're part of the equation.
And, you know, one of those is we did not get any details on sort of the progress on some of those significant sticking points, territory obviously being one of them, but also, of course, the potential joining of the Ukraine with NATO. It's been a topic and a dynamic and a possibility that has been discussed over and over really since the beginning of this war. I mean, again, you were a former NATO ambassador. The original version of this proposal, at least what was put out into the public, seemed to forbid Ukraine from joining NATO. I just wonder, what do you make of the implications there? And is that something that is essentially a non-starter for the Russians when they do get some of these details in front of that side?
The Russians have wanted a veto over Ukrainian membership of NATO, indeed membership of any country into NATO from the very beginning. Unfortunately for them, since they're not a member of NATO, they don't get a veto. It's just not how international politics works. The problem with the 28-point plan was not only that it prohibited Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO, telling it that it needed to be part of its constitution, but, and this is important, it required NATO to amend the treaty to prohibit further enlargement and further membership of European countries. That is just not a non-starter. And the Europeans have made very clear that the issue of alliance membership is an issue for the alliance, that is the 32 nations who are a member of NATO, and whoever wants to become a member, in this case, Ukraine. And that can't be nothing in this treaty, nothing in this agreement that prohibits that. These are sovereign decisions, and this is what this is about. The question is Ukraine going to be a sovereign, independent country able to make its own decisions without having to refer to Moscow? If the answer to that answer is no, Moscow wins this war, and therefore Ukraine will not sign on to it. If the answer to the question of whether Ukraine can be independent and sovereign is yes, then the question becomes, how is that security guaranteed? And that is something that NATO does best. I have long believed that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. Had it been a member of NATO, the war would have never started. And this idea that somehow you can resolve this war by allowing Russia to have a say over Ukrainian sovereignty strikes me as just absolutely the wrong way to go.
Ambassador Ivo Dolzer, appreciate the insight. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.